like in that. One thing I'm particularly interested in is if the current movement towards outcome assessment, does that make the evaluation of rigor irrelevant if it's all based on what students achieve? So I think that's probably enough to start with. So unless one of you want to volunteer, I'm going to start down there with Lisa.
Okay. So the first, I think, question.
Just tell us about what you do.
Okay.
All right.
I'll tell you what I do. So basically, we conduct academic reviews of non-collegiate learning. So non-collegiate learning, what is that? It can be corporate training, it can be apprenticeships, it can be programs, courses that are offered by non-degree granting entities. So companies that are providing online courses, many of them are coming to us for a review. And through the review process, which is an academic peer review model, we are looking at the comparability of that coursework to college level coursework, meaning we're looking at the instruction and we're looking at the assessments. And through that function, what we are trying to do is establish that comparability credit equivalency. So we set forth to make a college credit recommendation. When I say we, I don't mean me or my staff, but the academic review team that we bring together. So faculty from all over the world join us and participate in the review process. So ultimately, we hope with a positive outcome, we can set forth a college credit recommendation that is recognized by institutions throughout the country. We do have a list of cooperating colleges and universities. And again, it's not a guarantee that the college or university will recognize the credit, but it's a starting point. And so I think you'll hear from my colleagues that they are also involved in very similar work. So we'll
yes.
Roll.
Yeah, why don't we do that? Why don't we just go through this and describe what you do, and then I'll ask you the very pointed questions I want to ask you. So Leah.
Hi everyone, I'm Leah Matthews with the Distance Education Accrediting Commission, and my daughter asks me, Mom, what do you do? And to be honest, I'm on the phone or answering email most of the day. But aside from that, the DEAC is in its 91st year of an accrediting organization for distance education. We have 102 accredited institutions. DEAC is recognized by the Department of Education and the Council for Higher Education Accreditation. What's unique about DEAC is that most of our institutions do not participate in Title IV. Accreditation is sought for other purposes, to have entry into some of the professional accreditations, reimbursement from employers, other forms of tuition assistance are gained through DEAC accreditation. And I think one of the other driving factors of not being in Title IV is two little words that last week kind of landed with a grenade: regular and substantive interaction. Anybody that knows those two words knows that some pretty big news was released last week about the interpretation of those two words. That's because many DEAC schools offer their programs with flexible timeframes, competency-based, student-paced work, lots of different schedules of interaction between faculty and students. And as many of you know, there's lots of questions about how Title IV can fit in that model. Although that's not our topic for today, certainly it's of great interest in distance education, and DEAC looks forward to forging ahead with how teaching and learning happens effectively outside of some of the traditional academic calendars of learning. So.
Hi, I'm Mary Slesser. I'm the Director of Academic Assessment for CALE, the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. And unlike my colleagues, I am not in Washington, D.C. I'm actually based in Chicago. Within CALE, our mission is really to focus on helping adults earn credentials for their life, learning, and work. And when we define credentials, we move beyond just higher education degrees. We also include things like training, volunteering, on-the-job training, certifications, things like that. So we, very similar to the Lumina Foundation, with whom we work very closely, where we really try to help learners around the country figure out how to gain movement in their lives and earning more credentials to help them. Specifically, I'm on the higher education team within CALE, and I manage the Learning Counts program. Our program is focused on experiential learning or prior learning assessment, specifically portfolio development and assessment processes. I work very closely with students, so we offer a 4-credit course on portfolio development. So I'm responsible for the curricula and the faculty associated with the course that we provide students. We partner with colleges and universities around the country where we offer this service with that university, almost as an adjunct arm of a university, where we will teach students how to develop a portfolio. And then I have faculty that report in through me all over the country who are subject matter experts and credentialing experts, who then assess those portfolios against stated learning outcomes for potential college credit. When a student comes to us, they're actually basing the stories of their learning, or what we call a learning narrative, on a specific syllabus with stated learning outcomes from any regionally accredited institution. And then we are basing our assessment on that particular syllabus. So that's the crux of what I do.
So Kara.
Hi, I'm from the American Council on Education's College Credit Recommendation Service, which is such a mouthful that we have just shortened it to credit, ACE credit, with a capital C and capital letters following that, because we don't want to confuse big credit with little credit, right? So credits are small c's anyway. So back in the mid-1900s, ACE started evaluating military training for our service members that were coming back from the World War in order to help them to go back to school, acclimate back into society. And our sister program is the Military Evaluations Program. About 30 years after that launch, military started looking at occupations and MOSs for credit. And at that time, some smart person at ACE said, wait a minute, people in their jobs learn how to do things that are important too. Why couldn't we evaluate workforce training? And ACE credit was born. So very similar to Lisa, we do almost all of the same things, and contrary to popular belief, we are not going to have a boxing match on the 15th floor tonight. We're actually friends and colleagues and do a lot of good things together. So, and then we also do a little bit of what DIAC does, where we look at the organizations and determine the types of quality and rigor that they offer in their programs for the courses. So we have about 150 active organizations currently, with 500 historically, and 32,000 courses that have been credit recommended.
Okay. So, so the big question is then, picking up on what you've just said, how do you do that? Like, what does academic rigor look like? What do you look for? What are your team? I realize it's not you personally doing this, but what's the charge here for the teams? How do they determine what is and isn't rigorous? And how, and does that change depending on what kind of learning they're looking at?
So I would say that we determine rigor based on what higher education establishes as rigor at ACE. So basically, we use faculty evaluators similar to NCCRS to evaluate our courses. They are the ones measuring the rigor. So if what they are seeing in these non-traditional courses is aligned with the rigor that they would see in their classroom, that's when they're able to make that credit recommendation. I think it was probably back in maybe 2012 when there was a big shift from the accreditors about assessment, right? So it took a little bit of time for that to trickle down to us at ACE, maybe 6 or 8 months, where first some of our SACS faculty were saying, this assessment isn't up to par. And then some of our other faculty were saying, wait a minute, we have to do something different. So we went through a really big shift in how we communicated with our organizations about what rigor means. So we really look to guidance from our faculty members to set the tone, because we want these credits to be accepted at your institutions as equally as rigorous as the courses that you teach in the classroom.
Okay.
I would add that, peer review and faculty engagement is one of those fundamental tenets of accreditation, and all accreditors reach out to faculty and experts in the fields, whether it's teaching or practicing in a profession, to engage on what the curriculum content is. And another piece of it has to involve technology and the use of that technology. Is it appropriate? Is it effective? It is assuring academic integrity. Are we verifying who the learner is? Assessments aren't going to do us any good if we can't establish the academic integrity piece. And so I think rigor has to fold all of these aspects into the review process: peer review, external expertise, involvement of the professions if that's relevant, the appropriateness and accessibility of the technology, and the integrity of the student work and the integrity of the learning process and teaching and learning.
I would piggyback off of what both Leah and Kara have mentioned in terms of this definition of rigor and how it's subject to change in keeping with higher education landscape. We look at it from a very granular level, and we use tools that are available to us. So for example, the QM rubric is something that we would provide to, or at least mention as a resource to non-collegiate providers, saying you might need to look at these tools that are available to self-assess your level of rigor before coming to us for an evaluation, because we, like higher education, are also challenged by that definition of rigor. I heard a lot of conversation today about what is rigor? Well, in some cases, rigor means more books to read, more tests to take. That's how we get to rigor. In our world, in the work that we do in the evaluation process, we're looking at things that are just far more detailed than more. More doesn't equate to rigor. We're looking at the structured formal alignment of the assessments. We're looking at the varied evaluation methods that are used. We're looking at the multiple concepts that are being drawn together to construct new knowledge. I mean, when we think about rigor, we're thinking more of something that is not just a linear scaffold of learning, but is more of a spiral. So when we're working with non-collegiate providers, we are sharing with them the resources that are available that we find to exemplify rigor, and we're also looking at formative and summative assessments and the sophistication of the topics. So we are mirroring the process that you would expect in your own institutions. And it is a changing, evolving world when it comes to rigor. So I'm really excited that we're having this conversation and being here to glean more information from you in terms of what your definition of rigor is, because we need our process to actually demonstrate your viewpoints on rigor. So I was very excited to hear from some of the earlier panelists as well about reconceptualizing the way learning is measured. And I know that I'll learn some more from the other panelists here today.
So Mary?
From my perspective, the way that we gauge rigor is, first of all, we are closely partnered with regionally accredited colleges and universities. We only use syllabi that come from regionally accredited colleges and universities. So there is an assumption there that a certain level of rigor has gone into the curricula development process. Secondly, from our own perspective, from our assessment methodology, we operate off of a comprehensive rubric that takes into account primarily whether or not a student has fully demonstrated competence related to those course outcomes that are stated on that syllabus. In addition to outcomes, we're also looking at things like self-reflection. Is the student able to reflect on academic theory and broader concepts and ideas? Does that student provide compelling evidence that further demonstrates learning? Have they shown how they've applied that learning over time and continued to apply that learning even after a specific event maybe that they're citing as part of that learning narrative? And in addition to the outcomes-based part of the assessment, we're also focusing on things like writing ability. Does that student demonstrate, because this is a written portfolio, that they're able to write at a college level. So there is an expectation that just because a student comes and says, I have knowledge about this, I have learning in my background, our biggest challenge back to a student is that learning at the college level, and can you demonstrate it compellingly at that college level? So all of our assessors come from colleges and universities. They are actively involved in the ongoing development and maintenance of the rubrics that we utilize, both for undergraduate as well as graduate level assessment. And in addition to the quantitative score that a student might receive on the rubric, they're also receiving that qualitative feedback that talks about, this is exactly where you nailed this content, this is where you have opportunity for further learning, for further growth. And then we're hoping that that feedback then, if it does translate into a credit recommendation for the student, that student is still going to continue to learn and grow as a result of that.
So I'll push a little further on the idea of outcomes assessment, and clearly, Mary, that's what Kayla is looking at, the outcomes and trying to evaluate them. But we see a lot of pressure now, a lot of talk and political circles particularly about a push towards outcomes assessment, and I guess taken to the extreme, can we evaluate rigor on the basis of of the outcome? Is that a legitimate way to consider rigor when you're looking at a course of study or an academic institution's programs? And I'll maybe ask Leah to take that first.
One of the panelists immediately before us, I think it was our student, said learning is contractual. And I see academic rigor as going hand in hand with outcomes assessment. I mean, outcomes assessment is in fact measuring that rigor and measuring how well students have accomplished that educational objective, what the faculty assessment of that teaching and learning has shown through the outcomes assessment process, and how that outcome is mapped at the course level, at the program level, and at the institutional goals level. And when institutions do that well, when they've mapped their curriculum and their assessments effectively, then I think you're going to see that academic rigor threaded through the entire learning experience for the students. And I think accreditation has a model of engaging peer review and institutional improvement and outcomes assessment practice, as a way to tie assessment of rigor into all of those aspects of the institution. I think it goes hand in hand. One doesn't replace the other.
Right. Kara, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I was thinking about rigor being different. My group had talked about that rigor is different at each level, right? So, and the way that you measure it has to be different as well. And back to what Ashley said in the first panel about, we have to think about if we're measuring the rigor and the outcomes in a way that is counterintuitive to our students, or in a way that's really going to show what they're learning. So if we take UMUC as an example in their fire program, I would not want a firefighter in that program writing a paper about how to use the hose. Right? I want them out on the training ground showing me how they do it. It's a very low level of learning, but it's what's appropriate to measure the rigor of that type of an outcome.
So I think from my perspective, I think that outcomes or competencies are really great guidelines. They're a good starting point, but they're not the end all be all. And the reason I say that is that outcomes are not necessarily consistent. I look at syllabi from colleges and universities all week long, hundreds and hundreds of outcomes on a weekly basis. And no two syllabi are ever the same in terms of consistency. So while I might have one of the folks I was talking to during the small groups had said, well, what if my outcomes are just really, really easy? Well, the biggest challenge that I see is that outcomes are not always complete. I think that even though we have accreditation guidelines and the DEAC guidelines and ACE and NCCRS are so phenomenal in working with institutions in terms of credit recommendations, I think the biggest challenge that we have with outcomes-based assessment is that outcomes may do a great job at defining a verb and a subject. But if there's no criterion referencing, that then makes that outcome not quite enough to really fully define whether that outcome is considered rigorous, and a student doesn't know to what level he or she needs to be able to demonstrate that learning. So that's probably, from my perspective, and I could get on a soapbox about this all day, I promise you, but from my perspective, I think that's the biggest challenge in higher education that we have, is that, first of all, we don't have common definitions for anything. Prior learning assessment, outcomes, competencies, CBE. I mean, none of those things do we have a common definition for, but we aren't even consistent in terms of how we develop syllabi, how we develop those outcomes, so that students know consistently from course to course what that expectation is in terms of what they must be able to demonstrate as a result of that course.
In my view, I think that the shift towards outcomes assessment really underlies the importance of rigor, and especially in terms of the promise to the students. So Ashley mentioned that the syllabus, that's the contract, and you're stating to the students what they will be able to do after completing this course. A promise is made there, and it goes beyond an expectation when you start to drill down in the specific objectives and the way they'll be assessed. So I really think this shift towards outcomes assessment, particularly if it's done well, is an asset to rigor and can actually be a little bit of reverse engineering to get and arrive to that promise to the student. So I think that the shift will stay, and I think that there'll be more attention given to outcomes assessment. And it's something that we are at NCCRS really challenged by in terms of educating our non-collegiate providers, what that means and how to go about it, because it's still being developed in the field of higher education and in terms of the quality of outcomes assessment.
Okay, I have one last question for you, and then I want us to be able to solicit questions for either panel and conceptually around academic rigor. But if you had any guidance to give academic institutions, I guess particularly higher ed in this case, for how they might meaningfully and productively and rigorously be able to integrate and accommodate the different learning pathways that exist, and we see that this is really a growing trend, that students are looking outside of higher education. But what would you recommend to help higher education to be able to be a part of that pathway and help students have an on-ramp into credit-bearing degree programs? What would you suggest?
Well, I would say first that this is the new normal. Some of the commentary around accreditors is how the first-time full-time student really isn't the case anymore. We still have that fixation on iPads the first time for full-time, but we're not capturing 75% of the student enrollment because students aren't in that category anymore. They're bringing alternative learning, they're bringing courses they've taken online, they want credit for experiences they've had as volunteers or as professionals, not yet with a degree credential. And so I think we have a real responsibility to try to find ways to give access to teaching and learning that gives people credit for these types of learning experiences. And it's the kind of experts that are up here that I think can contribute to that discussion. So going back to rigor and having detailed curriculum maps helps align these alternative forms of learning. So if a student brings you a transcript that has a breakdown of that syllabus and can show you maybe some of their assessments, then you can map that to the curriculum at the institution and see, yeah, maybe this credit can transfer from this alternative site. Maybe it can be a meaningful contribution ultimately to the degree being awarded by this institution. I think the time has come to give learners credit for what they've accomplished. And if it is in fact a meaningful match with what an institution has to offer in their curriculum, it should be considered.
Any other thoughts?
You're here. I totally
Yeah.
agree with you.
I would also add that I would invite all of you, if you've never done a peer review with any of the organizations up here, join us. It is highly rigorous. There is a lot of great collegial conversation that happens. It is a team-based atmosphere. There are rubrics and structures, and I think the more that institutional faculty understand what happens in these third-party reviews, the better it will be for the student pathways. You know, I think that you'll be hard-pressed to find a student who has gone outside of the traditional pathway to do some work on his or her own, who says, I just want to do the bare minimum to get by to get this degree, right? Those are not the students that you're going to find who are taking this pathway. They're the ones who have shopped all of the different alternative providers because they have to pay money for some of them, so they're going to pick the best one that's going to give them the best outcomes. Or they're the ones who have tracked down their credits through workforce that happened maybe 8-9 years ago that NCCRS still has their information. They want to make sure it's counted. So these are the folks that are already going a little beyond in order to ensure that they have an opportunity.
Not only that, but Kale worked with the Illumina Foundation, and we did a study called Fueling the Race. That was a longitudinal study based on 48 institutions over 7 years, 62,000 students. And what we found as a result of that study was that students who had some form of alternative credit, or what we call prior learning assessment, or credit for prior learning, CPL credit, at the baccalaureate level, they were 2.5 times more likely to persist and graduate. At the associate's level, they were 2 times more likely to persist and graduate. In addition to that, we found that these students took up to as much as 8 more courses on their campuses that they did not need to take. They spent more time and more money on campus because they were recognized for the learning that they had coming into their degree plans. So it really is a matter that alternative learning is here. It's going to stay. It's not going anywhere. And in fact, it's probably that definition is growing more than anything. But recognizing that and becoming part of the national conversation, familiarizing yourself with the terms, and helping to create a common lexicon, I think is probably the first thing I would recommend. But become familiar with that, and then do get involved. And certainly, if you go to our CAEL website, www.cael.org, you can have access to a lot of research information and studies and different white papers and things that have been done related to this.
So let's, I want to leave a little time here at the end for your questions. Those of you who are here for both sessions had some time to talk to each other about this. And, if you have questions that are issues that came up that we didn't address, if you want to raise those, that would be, I'm sure the panelists, either set would be happy to take them. Yes.
For the earlier panelists, if you would like to come up here, I'll grab some chairs for you. This is great.
Can I go ahead and ask a question while you're getting set up? I'm Shauna Coles from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Will you talk a little bit about what you see, or in your vision of the future, uses of badging and other maybe ways to demonstrate? Because what you're talking about is so much that's going on behind the scenes. I'm just wondering, and maybe I'm just not as familiar with what is already available to students, employers, other institutions, so that it's more visual, what the students are getting credit for, related to what they can do.
I'll take that one. So at ACE, we work with Credly, who is initially Illumina funded, and now they've gone up on their own, to we have just implemented badges for all of our credit recommended courses. So as a learner hovers over that badge, it will tell them the learning outcomes, the topics, the credit recommendations that are being made. We are, in our next phase, transforming our transcript to make them interactive. So you'll be able to hover over the information and see what the competencies are that the students have learned there. So the Credential Engine, huge. We've been a part of that from the beginning, and I think that's going to be a really great place to go to see how everything connects. And the Open Badge platform has been really a game changer, I think, too. The Open Badge platform.
Paul, I wonder if you want to give a little definition of what the Credential Engine actually is in response.
Sure. Credential Engine will, above all, be a registry accessed through a choice of applications that will enable a user to gather information about programs appropriate to that student's objectives and to begin to make reasonable comparisons among them. It will not be a ratings service or a quasi-accreditor, but it will provide the user with the tools necessary to make some judgments and to reach some decisions. And as someone has said earlier, it is completely inclusive in terms of available credentials. So you'll find badges, you'll find associate degrees, you'll find bachelor's degrees, you'll find certification, you'll find certificates, and the two are different, of course. And so it is an attempt to bring together this wild west of credentials and to enable people to make sense out of it.
Just two comments. One about the Credential Engine. Paul and I were talking, and I think just as learningcounts.org will say that if a student comes and goes through their portfolio process and 3 or 6 semester hours credit are awarded for whatever, communication skills or writing or basic accounting, whatever it might be, all the schools who are member schools of learningcount.org will implicitly accept that credit recommendation. And I was thinking for the Credential Engine, and just looking at some of the partners yesterday of the Credential Engine, there are schools that will accept industry certifications for so many semester hours of credit in, say, network administration or other IT fields. It'd be wonderful if those were announced or, on the Credit Engine, because basically they become a pathway in the same way that your credit recommendations become a pathway to an institution. The other comment I wanted to make is not so much a question, it's just a comment. So what we have here are market intermediaries that translate training or experiential learning into academic credit or credit recommendation. So it's recognizable by accredited institutions to be accepted or imported into a degree program and to accelerate a student's pathway to graduation. I think it's interesting that academic institutions are going in the other direction, offering various kinds of certification that are not accredited or recognized for academic credit, but are valued by are valued by employers. And I'm thinking of this phenomenon of, say, MicroMasters on edX, or I think on Coursera they're called nano degrees, or maybe that's a Udacity term. I get my MOOCs mixed up. I think that's an interesting development. I don't think that will threaten the business models of ACE and so on. But it is an interesting development where, in this case, the market is making a judgment about what is valuable and what is not, and therefore professionals are going through those programs or those courses to achieve that credential. And one good example is on Coursera. Johns Hopkins offers a 10-course, I guess they call it a nano degree since it's on Coursera, in data science. And I noticed that the NSA, in a job announcement for a data science position, indicated that possession of that credential was equivalent to 1-year job experience for the purpose of applying for the position, and if you were hired, the level at which you would be paid. So anyway, not a question, just an observation that it seems that accredited institutions themselves are getting into the business of non-accredited or alternative education.
Well, I think that's a little, that is interesting to me as well. And I think what we're seeing, at least from NCCRF's standpoint, is that some of those MOOCs that were earlier established, you know, they had an intention to bring students in, to give students a chance to self-assess their own strengths and weaknesses and be able to prioritize where they needed to go in terms of developing the necessary skills to be successful in college. And then over time, what we've been finding is that some of those earlier MOOCs then also wanted to add that option to be able to have a review that would lead to academic credit. So we're really in an interesting place in higher education to see the emergence of so many opportunities for learners. And so I appreciate the observation and comments.
And I'm giving voice to someone who was in the previous session. This is not my original idea, but in talking about it in the small group activity, I heard the comment that for academics to talk about what we think is rigorous is a bit self-indulgent. That we're saying we're great and we're doing this. What we need to include also in the stakeholders is those employers, those external folks that are outside of academia. What do they have to say about this? And are we actually getting students to what they need to see?
That's a great point. We had a question back here.
My question was prompted by some of the remarks that we've heard from the panel about you can't just make credits easier to obtain, and it might be related to short-sighted legislators. So it's a political question, and I don't expect a political answer, but maybe you can help us give your insights to those of us who are dealing with the political dimension of this question. The question is really very simple. What happens when financial goals of the institution collide with academic rigor?
Who would like to take this? And sat down, didn't he?
Well, in 30 words or less, I think that, again, the answer really is concentration on student success and the documentation of that success in ways that are substantively appealing to legislators, that are a part of their core interests. And we don't often do a very good job of that in terms of how we describe student success. And I think we do need to describe it in terms that they appreciate and then go beyond that. We talk about the limitations of the surrogates of success, such as earnings and student loan payback. But I think we also need to recognize that those are, in some ways, legitimate measures. But then we need to go beyond that and to provide other measures, such as John Pepper, CEO of Procter & Gamble, used to say, we don't want you educated to be hired, we want you educated to be promoted. And so I think if we can provide that kind of information, we're really talking their language. And I hope rebuilding the sense of education as a public good as well as a private entitlement.
Hello. My question is about rigor. In academics, it's not always the outcome where the rigor is focused. It's the process of getting to the outcome. And so in assessing syllabi or assessing the rigor of training courses or courses offered in by employers, how do you measure process?
Well, from my perspective, the whole purpose of prior learning assessment is that a student should be able to demonstrate in a compelling way the outcomes of a course without the benefit of taking the course, the learning activities, the resources, the instructor, any of that. So we don't validate the process. We don't even really look for that. Where it does come into play a little bit is that the assessor who is reviewing a portfolio and reviewing those outcomes in the student's story is looking sometimes at what are some of the sample activities that maybe the person that wrote the syllabus, who drafted these outcomes, might have done in the classroom. And does the student reflect some of that? But it's not a requirement. So we're really focused on the ends, not the means, from our perspective anyway.
And I would say something similar for us. So we don't have a requirement of you must complete this many activities and this many readings in order to receive a credit recommendation, because we're working with workplace, and I'm going to leave the non-accredited providers of the world to the side, those who have the gen ed courses. But when we look at workforce, that corporation is training to their mission. So their goal is to get them trained, to get them on the floor. If they don't perform and can't do those outcomes well, they are fired, right? So the process of getting there for us is not as important as can they do it. Now, do we see more rigor in a training course where they have to actually demonstrate it as an on-the-job training? Typically, yes. But we similarly, it doesn't matter as much how they got there, but it's just that they got there and they can do it.
And I actually think my small group was excellent, but no one spoke, so I'm going to say we talked a lot about the process. So one thing that we were able to arrive at collectively was that rigor involves challenge. And whatever that might be, right? Someone threw out an example that if there is a course on how to tie your shoe, for most of us in this room, that would not be rigorous unless you did not know how to tie your shoe and then you were learning to do so, and then that could be considered rigorous, right? So there was a certain level of challenge. And I think that we talked a lot about that because one person mentioned also that maybe a way to kind of feel this process is to do some pre and post like evaluations, right? Like we always evaluate students right after the course where it's really fresh in their mind, and either they're jaded and they hated what they did or they really, really liked it. But I think it would be interesting to do some survey 3 years out, 4 years out, right? Because rigor doesn't connote enjoyment. We don't think, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to enjoy your course for it to be rigorous. In fact, probably courses that are rigorous for students are the ones that are a pain in the butt and end up giving you those skills that you need down the road. Skills like confidence, skills like resilience, right? Skills like staying up all night to study or, committing to a task. Those are things. And so I actually think that the process is very important. I think and that was a great question. I think the process is so important to that conversation.
And I would speak to NCCR as part of our criteria when we're looking at non-collegiate learning. We're looking at the instructor's qualifications and credentials, and we have a certain criteria and a standard that must be met. And when our evaluation team is on site conducting these reviews, the non-collegiate providers often are very challenged by the evaluation process, and it may take 2, 3, 4, 5 years and more attempts in order to pass our standard for a credit recommendation, because we are looking at, our evaluators are looking at that process. And it's amazing when you're working with, say, an apprenticeship provider, and they will say things like, how do you know? How do you know someone has learned? Well, we know, and we wouldn't let them work on a $5 million piece of equipment unless we knew and thought intuitively that we thought. And we said, well, that's not good enough. How are you measuring that learning? And what process are you using? And we're doing a lot of academic consulting in some ways. So the process is very important. And I know that with corporate training, as Kara said, if there's a body of people who are not performing, they're no longer there. So there is proof in the pudding of that process as well. So good question.
So this is, my world is really that. So I'm not in a university, so I'm really interested in all these alternative paths. However, not in the United States. So I want to ask anybody that would have an answer. I actually sent an email to Credential Engine through their info to find out what are the trends possible in going to a more globalized view of this, things for in Spanish and other languages, connecting countries. Is there anything?
I could speak to that a little bit. Going international is really, really challenging. At DEAC, we've had a number of institutions that have expanded internationally. We have found that governments outside the United States are very interested in what's going on with distance education enrollments. We've met with many ministries of education, and higher ed is, as you know, much more controlled as a government function, and quality assurance is carried out by governments, not these independent private organizations. And so, there's I guess a bit of skepticism about it. Still a lot of preconceived notions about distance ed and a lack of quality just because it's distance education. I attended an Inquahe conference in Bahrain about 6 months ago. It was attended by about 70 international organizations on quality assurance, and all of them were still where the United States was 15 years ago. How can anything possibly be quality in a distance education teaching and learning setting? And so I think that there's some educating to do and some acclimating to what quality is and what rigor is in distance education, that groups like this can share on an international scale.
I'll just mention that you can Google Credential Engine and get a lot of information about it. Google Credential Engine, and within a very short time, the registry will be open, fully open, and accessible to anyone. It's been in a kind of pilot form so far, but it may already be open, but certainly just about this time, it's on the brink of being open and accessible, and then you can begin to navigate it. But you could begin just by Googling.
Okay, well, I want to say thank you to everyone. I feel like there are probably some questions that we didn't get to. We definitely would like to continue the conversation in a number of different ways. One easy way, perhaps, is via Twitter at #AcademicRigor. I know that we had a lot of great information from the panelists today, and we didn't solve the question of academic rigor, obviously, so we're going to be moving forward on this, but I do think that it is well established that this is a very important conversation to have for so many different reasons. I want to say thank you so much to the panelists, and Deb, is there something else you would like to?
I just want to thank everybody for, especially those of you who've been through both sessions here late in the day. But I think that's why we're all here, right? Quality matters and academic rigor matters. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.